Hello, today is all about PRs. Let me get that notification off the screen. Where is it? There we go. Okay. PRs, pull requests. State of pull request 2024. I mean, if you're not new to the show, you will know that we're not huge fans of pull requests here. But most of you are, or at least you are forced to use pull requests in a way that's a little bit cumbersome. And usually teams that are stuck in PR hell aren't really looking for or entertaining even adopting any alternatives because they think there aren't any. And there are quite a few. They're mostly cultural alternatives. You know, you don't need to use a different tool. But it does take a mindset shift. And I think that's what makes it difficult. If there was a simple tool that you could just adopt, we would be doing it. Let me share my screen on which one is this? This is that one. There we go. Okay, so some of you have suggested we have this is the agenda for today. So 10 bullet points, and we'll keep it to about an hour. If you have any questions, I'll interrupt and stop, and we'll adjust the questions. Adrian isn't with us here today. Adrian is on vacation. So, and I know Adrian would love to be here with us today. So we're gonna keep this a little bit shorter than usual and leave a little bit more for next time when Adrian is here again. We are making a content plan for the show for the next few months. And we are definitely putting trunk-based development, pull requests, and continuous delivery and different forms of collaboration on that plan. So there will be more. Today, we're going to give you a quick overview on what's really going on in the sort of the modern day and age of engineering work. Let's start. Actually, just give me a live sign. YouTube. I see there's people on YouTube, LinkedIn. If chat is working, give me a thumbs up. Where are you from? If you have any questions, I know you probably don't have any questions this early. It's okay if you say hello. Just making sure we don't have any technical issues. Let's start. So first of all, I just want to look at what's a pull request. A pull request. Now, we're already looking at complexities based on your tools. Generally, Ali, hey, it's great to see you. Okay, it's working. Hey, I figured our LinkedIn metrics were not correct because I'm seeing 0 for LinkedIn. Hello from Germany, Thomas. Hello. So pull requests are. Let's start with GitHub. In GitHub, pull requests are requests to merge a certain branch to main. Generally, like you can set them, but usually you're merging a branch from main a branch to main. However, pull requests, the way they're now, I did some research on this. I didn't find anything reasonable. I don't know when we started adopting the term pull request per se. Other than code review. I was back in my day. We called them code reviews. On GitHub, if you're an open source project, there are these things called forks. A fork is when you have a full copy of the entire repository. So you have a full copy of the entire repository, which means you have a copy of each of the branches. So imagine you have main and 7 branches. If you fork that repo, you'll have a second copy of main and those 7 branches. So you'll have 14 in total. Anjana, hello. Yes, YouTube is working as well. Awesome. What are you using, by the way? What terminology? Let's start with that. In your companies, do you call it a pull request? Do you call it a code review? Do you call it a merge request? I've heard that one before. Then there's the stacked diffs terminology for the stacked diffs strategy. Do you call it a stack? Do you call it a commit? Do you call it a slice? Do you call it a patch? Right, in the CVS days, we called them patches. Let me know, and then we continue from there on the discussion part. So a pull request is also when you are pulling something in from a forked repository, right? So imagine you have 2 branches like this, and this entire structure is copied one more time as well, and you're saying, take not main from my fork and merge it into main on your fork. I didn't change main, you don't have my branch, right? So this boundary between our repositories is just a technical detail. The point is I have a branch, you don't have it, and I want it to go into your repository. People way overcomplicate pull requests across forks sometimes. Usually they're also from main to main. So you, on your fork, you work directly on main. You do trunk-based development on main, and then you pull from your main to their main. That's sometimes a little bit more benign, sort of sane workflow. But people overcomplicate them in millions of different ways. I don't want to get into they're as much as I can today. I don't want to complain and get into the weeds of all the possible dysfunctions. We're just going to look at like the most common one, which is the merge blocking pull requests. Thomas mentions, I think pull request was announced by GitHub. I'm not sure. See, I'm not sure. I recall. I know. I suspect that GitHub popularized it, but I'm not sure. It's definitely Git terminology, but I'm not sure if GitHub was the first one to popularize it, or whether it was the Linux kernel team, or whether it was the Mercurial team. I would have to. My research didn't. I got a lot of fanboyism towards GitHub, but it was very difficult to find any clear material on. Maybe there wasn't a first one. Maybe it just co-emerged at about the same time on different platforms. That's also possible. Caliban mentions in GitLab it's merge requests. Yes. Thomas mentions I call it pull request, or PR for short. And I see a PR as a kind of a patch for code that isn't that I'm not that you're not owning. Okay. A suggestion for code changes. Yeah. Anjana, merge domain. Okay. Okay. So you can already see, what is it? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people. Everybody's using different terminology, right? So this is usually where it starts. And it only gets worse from here. Okay. So usually what's in a pull request usually is it has a name. The pull request itself has a name. The pull request can have a description on GitHub. Sorry, on Bitbucket as well. Usually it will be merging, depending on what terminology you're using, it will be either from, from not main to main, and it's using branch terminology. It can also be using the terminology base and not target, but base and branch, I think. And sometimes it will be brace and commit, and it's a particular commit. These are usually patches. I think the most common one is the GitHub one, right? So it's hard to get away from GitHub, but obviously you've already demonstrated that if you're not using the most popular tool, which is GitHub, then the most popular terminology doesn't apply to you. So, I don't wanna short circuit by overgeneralizing. So let's just say usually there's a point A and point B to the pull requests, and usually the pull request originates from the branch, from a branch, if you're using branches. The pull request will contain one or more commits. Usually there's nothing to merge if there's 0 commits. The best thing I can tell you is keep it to 1 commit. If you have several commits, there's already possible issues there. And yeah, the branch will have an author, or it might be a compendium of all the authors on the branch. And generally, what the branch software, like the software that oversees the pull request, there will be different strategies on like what's going on behind the scenes, right? So is it flagging the pull request as approved, or maybe there will be some secondary way, maybe it will be mergeable, or maybe it will be blocked, right? So there's all these different terminologies that can influence like what can be done and cannot be done with the PR. It can be conflicted. Generally, after you merge a pull request, if it was a merge blocking pull request, you would delete the pull request, or you'd archive it. You'd delete the branch, possibly, hopefully. So that's one aspect. Yeah, Kalian, I worked with a client that used Bitbucket last year. Bitbucket has very much GitHub compatible terminology. Yeah, I know Bitbucket primarily from having hosted Mercurial projects. Yeah. But I've only ever used Bitbucket from Git. I mean, with the Git client. I don't know what Bitbucket is running under the hood. I'm assuming Git, but I've never used it with a Mercurial repository. I used Subversion as well. We didn't really have any concept for pull requests on Subversion. We just merged stuff and had conflicts and reviewed code. Okay. Any questions so far? This is step 0. This is basics. Our immediate focus for now will be merge blocking pull requests. Which graphic do we want to use? Let's use this graphic. Right. So a pull request, imagine it has two areas, right? You can start sort of here and it ends sort of here, right? So the new changes are here, This is everything that was developed on main while we were gone on the branch. And then if we do make it to main will either have a merge commit that will connect with both branches. So main will have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it'll have like a double parent commit that'll have 6 and 5. Or if you're using the rebase strategy, the 5 will go on top of the 6 and the history will be flat. In Git, this is called rebasing or a fast forward if you're going the other way around, right? Again, a lot of people will tell you a lot of different things here, presenting it as practical advice. Just use whatever is sane for your team, whatever saves you the most time. A merge blocking PR is when somebody says there is work here, there is work on this branch, and it is not allowed to join the main line until it has been reviewed, until there was a pull request. Now, what's the issue with this? Now, I think this is common procedure in most companies, especially companies that don't practice strong-based development. But I see it used even in some companies that do practice strong-based development, and they just have short-lived branches or single commit PRs. So this idea of blocking merge between the branch and the main implies that there is something very much unhealthy about this branch that needs to be fixed before it can go to main. Because let's look at what's really going on in the underlying ecosystem. You know, what does a PR even produce? Right? If I look at the PR itself, what does it produce? Well, in most cases, it produces comments or a status update. But if you look at it more clearly, as far as documentation goes, the commits are from Steve, and the approval will come from Alice, let's say. Right? The approval will come from Alice. Now, the danger here, and this is why I don't like PRs, is that us humans, we assume this is the equivalent of Alice having co-authored all commits. Because obviously Alice looked at everything, right? And Alice contributed to every commit just as much as Steve did by virtue of reviewing it and approving it. That's an assumption that we implicitly make. And usually people tell me that's why they use PRs, because it provides this kind of behavior. And this is silly, because the bigger the PRs are, the less time Alice spends on this freaking code change. And I can tell you that regardless of how well you review it, if Steve was developing alone, Steve holds vastly superior knowledge about this pull request than Alice does. Alice might not even have checked it out on her local machine and ran it. Which, you know, back in my day, they told us, no, when you review a PR, you need to check it out on your local system, run it, run the tests, check if it works, and then only then approve it. And then shortly after, we stopped using PRs. Again, this is misconception number one. When a PR is merge blocking, people usually use it for this reason. In a local code base, so not an open source project. Kalion mentions there's also squash merge strategy that does just one commit with all the changes from the branch. Yes, so it squeezes the branch together to one commit before it makes it into mainline. I love squashing commits, but also you can also do that locally. I wouldn't automate that procedure. Sometimes there are two very different commits in the branch. If you're interested in Git and details of rebases and merges, I can recommend the book Rebase by Pascal Precht. Ooh, that's a good book recommendation. Thank you. And yes, with the link, rebasebook.com. Thank you. Oh, that's awesome. Okay. Cheers. Okay, so that's misconception number 1. Why do you approve at your company? Think about that. Why do you have PRs? And think about it from a perspective of documentation. When a commit goes through pull requests, review, how is the commit different after it was merged? Just think about that for a moment. How is the commit different after it was reviewed? Okay, what else? Purpose of review. Good. We're on time. Okay. So purpose of review. How is the commit different after it was reviewed? After it went through the pull request procedure? Think about that. What do you think? What changes? If I look at it from from a data perspective, what data do we add to the commits, to the branch, to the merge procedure with pull request? Kalgan. Local testing by Alice. Nowadays, very often there are CI pipelines that automate that part. That's an interesting point. But then if that's automated, why isn't the branch also merged when the CI pipeline says it's green? That's a great point. So here's one of the purposes of a pull request. There might be something terribly wrong with one of the commits. Actually, let's change one of the commits. Right? So the second commit might introduce a security issue, and a human needs to see it. Or there might be a config setting missing, and a human needs to say, hey, there's a config setting missing. Or there might be a design issue, and a human needs to say, a human different to Steve needs to say that, yeah, you missed something, back to the drawing board. And then the result of that pull request is a third commit that wouldn't have otherwise happened. And we call these pull requests merge blocking pull requests or merge requests, because then Alice acts as a gatekeeper that incentivizes Steve to add something to the branch because she is blocking merge. So she is telling Steve, I will force you to add the fix because I am saying no. Let's think about that for a moment. Thomas mentions a PR can be a kind of documentation, but honestly, who of you looks at a closed PR again later? I agree, nobody does. I don't even look at commit messages. What I look at in history, I mean, when I'm doing forensics, I look at commit messages. But primarily what I'm looking for is authors, frequency of change. I'm looking for age of PRs. I'm looking for age of branches. I'm looking for change frequency in a certain file, in a certain system. A request for change. Yes, it's a very mild way of saying, hey, you're not done with this, come back. Right, because what happens? Right, what happens? Steve is working on one thing. Then he opens a PR. And then while he's waiting for an answer to the PR, he potentially, and this was main, right? This was main. And while waiting for the PR, he will then do one of two things. He will open up a new branch from the old main, where he started off from, and start working on a second thing, or he will open up a new branch from where he left off and continue on with work while he's waiting for the branch. The first situation he does when he's working on something completely unrelated. And then the second situation happens when he needs the code that was in that branch. Right? And then if your merging strategy follows like this, then this is called diff stacking. And if your merging strategy follows like this is what you would normally call GitHub flow, or just pull requests in general. But what Alice does to Steve with the pull request, as Kalian mentions, with the request for change, is that Alice tells Bob, hey, stop working on 2, come back to this ticket you thought was done and add a change to it. So now Steve has to make a context switch. But while he's doing the context switch, whatever he was working on is unfinished and is waiting. And when this gets merged to main, whatever he was working on will now be out of date with main. It's even worse if he was stacking the diffs, but at least the diff stacking community is aware of that and has tools to help with that. I'm not going to talk too much about diff stacking today. Now, what's the issue with this? The issue with this is that Alice also has her own stuff to do. So while Alice spent like an hour reviewing that box, and then Steve was working on something else, Alice also has her own branches, and she's waiting for Steve to review some of hers. So imagine this entire picture was duplicated, and there's 2 people waiting on 2 reviews working on 4 things simultaneously. How much is done? Right? So what's our work? We have 2 people. There's 4 tasks. None of them are merged. And seemingly there's 8 channels of communication. Right? So Steve has created PR1. He's waiting for feedback on PR1. He's working on PR2 that's still unfinished. Alice is working on PR3 and she's waiting on feedback on PR3. And she's working on PR4 after having given a change request to Steve to come back to PR1. Right? And then this just keeps going. And then once one of them is merged, they might conflict with all the open branches, and you can see where this is going. This is why I'm sort of opposed to this kind of pull requests. Right, but I asked you a question. Remember what I asked? I asked you, what does it produce? Well, what it produces is simple. What is a group of software engineers called? A merge conflict. I like that. What does it produce? Like, what is the output of a pull request? Well, the output of the pull request, as I said earlier, it can be this tag. Now, this tag can cause, in the AI world, we talk about hallucinations. This tag can cause hallucinations. If Alice has approved it, sorry. If Alice has approved this PR, it might give the indication that there are now 2 people responsible for these changes. And some certifications require that. And people then think that if you need 2 sets of eyes on each change, then pull requests are necessary. And that's bollocks. That's nonsense. Because what you can do with Git is you can put 2 authors on every commit. Now this is, I just don't want to jump ahead. Purpose of review, commits, alternatives, pairing efficiency, ownership, touch points. Okay. So the purpose of the review is to add something to the commit. Either ask for changes, but then that might be a little bit bizarre. It might add a second tag, a second author onto a group of commits, which in the case of a pull request is separate from the repository. If you have ever used Bitbucket, the pull requests are a separate concept than the commit history. In GitHub, it's a bit different. Right? So the pull request information, the comments on the pull requests are in one repository, and the code changes are in a different repository. And that, to me, that has always seemed a little bit weird. Like, why aren't the code comments on a pull requests going into the commit, so that after I merge them, I know that there's a comment on this file. And if you've ever used Fisheye or Crucible, that's how it was. And I really enjoyed that tool, but it's ridiculously expensive for what it offers. It's nonsense. Right. And what the third thing, fourth thing that pull requests offer to you, like changes to your history, is that it might incentivize somebody to add a commit to this branch, rather than merge it and then add it on main. Now, let's look at commits in one commit. In GitHub, it's possible to do this. Okay, just to be clear, we've done this, we've done this, we've done this. We are now on commits. Okay. So commits can have several authors. So I can add 2 authors onto a commit and say every commit that has 2 authors has been pair programmed, and those commits don't need review. Which means I don't need a pull request. Which means I can push it directly to main. So I don't follow this workflow. My commit simply ends up on main, and I rebase onto main. And then I push only if it's a fast forward. And if it's not a fast forward, I rebase. And I keep doing that until I get the timing right. And my commit can safely go to main. Right? So that workflow is the equivalent of this. That workflow is the equivalent of this. Didn't pop over. And my commit goes here. Right? But the point is that then, if it's a fast forward, that's the equivalent of main. And practically speaking, that is the equivalent of a straight line, because I can just do it like this instead. Right? So this is the equivalent of the picture it just was a moment ago. This is a fast forward merge. Right? I have one commit on a branch. If I rebase all the changes into my branch, and I rebase my commit on top of those, and then I ask for a merge, if there isn't a explicit merge commit happening, I could just do this. And to me personally, this is my preferred way of doing trunk-based development. 2 authors on a commit, or 1 author and the second author in the comments. That was reviewed, merged, done. The other thing you can do with commits that, I don't know how much you know this, but there are, I don't want to go into the detail about semantic commits right now, but it's very easy to tag in a commit or to leave certain keywords or add links where you can post in the link of the commit what kind of change it is. And then you can say that only behavior changes need to be reviewed. Complex behavior changes need to be reviewed. That config changes, chores, documentation, those can all be merged in without review. Now, merged. Now, I didn't say there are 2 authors on it, right? So that's now a separate problem. Okay. Because now we need to discuss alternatives to PRs. One of the things you can do is actually go do code reviews. So rather than going on the branch, and you need a branch for that, which is silly, and then open a pull request because you want to review the code, you would merge it to main because it's still not deployed, right? So when it's on main, it's not deployed. Deployment happens at some point later. If you're continuously deploying, then it might be deployed immediately, but it might be feature gated or feature flagged in some way. The point is, if it's stable to merge, if you have testing automation that says, yes, it's stable to merge, it has two authors, it's already reviewed by both of the authors, we just merge it in, then you can still ask for a review. You can say everything between this and this line needs a review. And you do that explicitly. Now, for what reason? Now, I know on GitHub, this is annoying. GitHub does not allow this kind of workflow, which is why I'm sometimes sad about the way GitHub works. There are hacks around this, obviously. You can open up a branch from that, and then... But usually GitHub will not allow you to use the pull request tool to review code because there's nothing really practical to do there because there's nothing to merge. Most code review tools that are good at code reviews won't allow you to do code reviews unless there's a merge happening, right? So most tools are merge blocking, which I think is sad because there are much better alternatives. Dennis, do you mean a co-author on a commit? And is it right you said in this case no PR is needed? It sounds easy. And why do we work with PRs? What are they still needed for? Well, they aren't really needed. It's just that, people think that there will be chaos if everybody merges the main, because they might not have a, let's say, rigorous enough discipline in their engineering culture where people don't just commit shit. And what I mean by this is, you being on a branch and you forget something and you add and you say, oh, oops, git commit, oops, git commit dot, git commit WP, work in progress, with the WIP, work in progress. Usually people have PRs so that you as a developer slow down and you clean up your branch and then you merge it to main, so that garbage doesn't actively make it to the Git history of main. That's, I think, where it started, but it got blown way out of proportion. Because you can maintain that level of discipline on your own computer by not pushing, right? I can merge to main, and I can say, oops, whip, oopla, blah, 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 whoopsie, and then I can squash. And then I push. And maybe the push is done in such a way that I will still open a pull request for that one squashed commit. I don't have a branch. I will open up a branch just to push that commit, right? Because when I shadow engineers, usually, is it fair to say usually? Well, okay. Let's make it context specific. Let's assume you're using GitHub and Jira, right? What the developers will usually do in that context is they don't call this branch whatever. They will start from a ticket in Jira. The Jira ticket will have an identifier, and then they will call this branch the ticket number, so that then Jira can track it. That's nonsense, by the way. And then they spend a lot of time, and sometimes that's not enough, and they end up having to name these branches. And then they end up having to name the pull requests, right? So once you start doing this, you'll realize that the ticket has a certain name and text, and the branch has a certain name, and the pull request will have a certain name and text. And suddenly there's documentation in the code, there's documentation in the tests, there's documentation in the wiki, there's documentation in Jira, there's documentation in the pull request, and there's documentation in the release notes once you actually end up deploying, right? So one commit we'll end up with like 7 different areas of fragmented documentation. It's so whoever said, Thomas, yeah, a PR can be a kind of documentation. Yes, it can be a kind of documentation, but nobody really reads them. So any documentation, I think, that you put into PRs is hugely wasted. And I've done this before. Sometimes I wrote essays in PRs trying to mentor somebody. I love your approach of local PRs, questioning all the apps, and committing directly to main. Yeah, that's the simplest option. Now the issue is, if I commit, pull, and commit, pull. Now I need to have discipline to know which of the commits were mine and I haven't pushed yet. Because then if I squash them, I will also change the commits that I've pulled in, and that might be dirty, right? So again, but that's only a problem if I don't push enough. And to some degree, people use branches for that, right? So they're not. But then again, if I'm not, why am I pulling? If I'm pulling more than once before I pushed, that's a workflow problem, and you can overcome that by discipline. If I pull, 1 day passes, pull, 1 day passes, pull, squash, and then push, that's a workflow issue. I'm not working in small enough steps, and I think that it is not working in small enough steps, which that makes people gravitate towards pull requests and merge blocking, and because they don't want to be annoyed by the mess of people who don't work in small enough steps. Now, the issue is high-performing teams are high-performing because they work in small steps, and the amount of ceremony and documentation necessary caused by the pull request culture is so enormous that they will have to slow down and become less efficient. So that's my main critique here. I've been in environments like that where you just move so fast that every ticket, every PR, every freaking subtask, sub PR, stacked diff is just slowing you down needlessly. There's a clear goal. The team is on the same page. Nobody benefits from the ticket being there. It's not necessary for any certification. It's not necessary for any kind of procedures. The information will still be there. The pair programming individuals who are present on the ensemble are still documented in the commit. And there's still a ticket or a release plan denoting what actually happened and when. And possibly even linking it up to all the commits that are in that time frame, right? So that's where I'm coming from. That's my perspective. Hang on, let me clean up. So that's one aspect. Yeah, let's clean this up as well. What else? Let me check comments so I don't miss anything. Okay. Yes. The second reason people tell me they love pull requests is because that's how they mentor their juniors. And that is such a blatant waste of time, right? Because think about it. I mean, I'm not saying they're wrong. I'm just saying, it's just a lame excuse. They should be mentoring their juniors. But there's better ways about it. Where's the best approach? Yes. Yeah. So imagine, I need name tags. Yeah, there we go. Alice and Steve. Let's say Alice is the more senior of the two, and Steve is building a feature. Right? With the traditional, I mentor my juniors approach, Steve is working, Steve is working, Steve is working, Steve is working, Steve is working. Alice is working on her own stuff while Steve is working. And then when Steve is kind of done, Alice goes into mentor mode. And then she looks at Steve's pull requests. Alice looks at the pull request in front of her and leaves comments. And tries to teach Steve, and hey, this looks good. You could improve this a little bit. And that's all great. And then Alice goes back and works on her own stuff. Steve, in the meanwhile, now has 2 PRs open. He stops working on number 2, comes back to number 1. looks at Alice's stuff, and he's like, oh, god damn it, she left me so many comments. Oh, okay. Right? And it's not helpful. It's frustrating. Early on, especially if you have a very benevolent, very patient mentor, it gets a bit easier. But I've yet to see someone who isn't just slightly annoyed at receiving comments. Why am I saying this in a negative light? People usually think I'm criticizing Alice for mentoring Steve. And that's not what I'm doing. Right? Looking at a timeline, right? The past is at the bottom, and the present is somewhere towards the top of this Git timeline. My critique is, why didn't Alice start mentoring here? That's my critique. Right? Coming from an extreme programming background, why did it take Steve thinking he was done to then get coaching? Right? So it's like, you let me go down the wrong path to see what I'm capable of, and then you give me advice, which is great if you're a driving instructor and this is my only chance, and then I have to pay you again to redo the test, and it has to be 100% accurate, and it's very easy to get 100% accurate, right? So it's very objective. There is nothing that you and I could possibly subjectively disagree on style. That there's only one correct way of building this feature. But Alice, if she was building the feature, she would have built it completely differently to Steve, right? So there is a lot of subjectivity, and the amount of possible solutions is almost endless. So my criticism is usually, why do you let Steve work alone, potentially producing stuff that will then just get marinated, and then he'll just increase his work in progress counter, because obviously Alice is so freaking busy that she couldn't pair with Steve for like an hour. Because even if Steve takes 16 hours to produce these 5 commits, Alice could at least take 1 hour each day to pair with him. And they could have reviewed what he did while he was coding and merged it, even if it wasn't finished. Introduce feature flags. Now we're at the alternatives. One of the alternatives is feature flagging. Obviously, you have to remove them every now and then. Prune the feature flags so they don't get too spammy. But the point is, if Alice checks in regularly with Steve and they pair together so that Alice maintains context, they can say, yeah, you know what? Everything up on this point looks good. Merge it. What's the issue? Or if it's not good, he immediately fixes it while she's still present, and then doesn't end up creating commits that would get potentially rejected, or not rejected, but requested for change. Right? That's one aspect. The second aspect is, if Alice needs to urgently work on her own stuff, well, rather than Steve going on working on his other branch, if he really needs pairing help from Alice and she's too busy to pair, rather than Alice is too busy. I need to be very precise here. Alice is of the opinion that what she's working on is so important that the review of Steve's pull request can wait. If that's the case, my criticism, my recommendation is, rather than Steve now being blocked on this PR and going on working on a second thing, he should go and join Alice. Right? So they should be buddied up to the point that, yeah, the two of them can work on 2 things at the same time, but always keep buddying up on whatever the highest priority is. Because otherwise, what this communicates, Alice has a high priority, Steve has a low priority. So because Steve is working on a low priority thing, he will be blocked until Alice is done with her high priority thing. Now, what does this produce? This produces an environment where Alice cannot get support because she's the only smart person who understands this high priority thing, and everybody else is busy with low priority things. Now, at the same time, Steve's commits are merge blocked, and they cannot be appropriately solved unless Alice is done with that high priority thing. Now, there might be Bob involved, and Bob is also not working on a high priority thing. So Steve waits for Alice, doesn't get any response in like 2 hours, and then tomorrow morning mentions in the sprint planning and the huddle that, hey, nobody reviewed my review, nobody reviewed my code. And then now Bob jumps in because Bob knows that Alice is busy, and Bob reviews it. And Bob is busy with his own two branches, right? And then this this situation just keeps on festering. And what this produces is a constant non-zero state of work in progress stuff. There's always something in freaking progress. Because if Alice and Steve work together on this and they merge it, and then Alice says, you know what, that's cool, but don't continue with the rest. Come over here, let's work on this, and then let's go back to your stuff. And if you can do it alone, then once I have given you feedback and I know that you've learned and adopted the feedback, then you can work alone and I work alone, and we split up and we self-approve, or we pair up for a joint review session where we review both branches, right? So again, merge blocking in place, but the reviews are becoming synchronous. The reviews are becoming more pairing oriented, and even the commits can have multiple commits. And then you can automate that commits with several authors do not require review. They can be automatically merged if they're safe to merge. If you have testing automation that can tell you that the merge was not safe, even better. Anjana says, giving feedback early depends on trust between Alice and Steve. It can be easily mistaken for micromanaging. I agree. The issue is, I would err on the side of micromanaging because, right, so the alternative that you're suggesting is that if I'm Alice and I leave Steve alone because I don't want to micromanage Steve, then Steve now thinks that he needs to prove himself to earn the trust to be able to merge himself or to self-approve. That's one of the bonus points that we'll discuss later. Or that he needs to work alone for a certain time before he gets the team's attention. If Alice and Steve require trust to work together on the same thing at the same time, that is a untrusting environment where Alice and Steve have obviously different priorities. But then they are not team members, right? Like, that setup is not a team. It cannot possibly be in a team. Which means if they're not a team, then why is Alice reviewing Steve's work? If they're not a team, why is she reviewing his work? If he's alone, he should approve alone. Now, there are very large organizations where the maturity is so high that you just need somebody else. Like on Google, at Google scale, you have a code change, you have a stack, and you're sending it to 7 people, and you just need somebody's approval. And if they approve it, then it goes through. That's a slightly different, like, that is an extreme of a heavily regulated, bureaucracy-leaning organization, and I wouldn't use that as a norm. I see a lot of people cite that example, and I don't think a lot of people are realistically in that situation for the right reason. Meta, for example, Facebook, stack diffs a lot, and they have a very strong stack diff culture, diff stacking culture, right? Where you are constantly in this, I will continue working on my branch, and then you just zip it backwards, right? You just keep zipping my branch into main. it has the opposite effect. Rather than my branch being merged, the mainline keeps zipping up behind my commits. But it requires very, very, very good understanding of Git tooling. So organizations like Meta and Google, they do this because as a default, they already have custom tooling and custom workflows on top of every single tool they use. They would have a custom Jira, custom build pipelines, custom Kubernetes, custom Git, custom, everything is customized already to the degree that they can just build customized tools to promote this workflow, and then they promote it through internal governance. But smaller organizations will never be in this scenario. Smaller, like the 99.999% of all engineering teams do not have these challenges, do not have these requirements, and they get no benefit from working like this. Okay, hang on. There's some comments now. Sorry for splitting the discussion up a bit. So Thomas mentions, I found that juniors like to start on their own and don't like it when Alice is there all the time. Juniors, quote unquote juniors, yeah, thank you for quoting, seem to feel as if we are controlling them. I think, see, wait, there's more comments. Yeah, psychological safety. Yes. See, this comment, I used to be pro this comment. I used to think like this. But that was only because I was in a very low trust, very low psychological safety environment for a very long time, early on in my career. Right? So the point is, if psychological safety and collaboration and learning from each other and being open-minded are hallmark qualities in that organization, then you would never think that collaborating with somebody is controlling. Never. You help me with my stuff, I help you with your stuff. We're done by lunch. Right? Like the two of us will close 2 tickets by lunch. I see no problem with that. And if you don't know what to do and that's embarrassing, good. Maybe I can teach you something instead of save you trouble. Maybe I can learn something from you while you're learning. Right? So this is a double-edged sword. You know, this whole idea of not wanting to control them. If you don't want to control them, why can't they merge to main? Right? Like to me, it doesn't go hand in hand with what I said earlier, right? It's if Steve is working here and Alice approves here, if you don't want to be controlling, then let Steve approve his own branch PRs and merge to main without Alice's help. If you trust him, if you don't want to be controlling. But if you want to be controlling, but asynchronously so we can optimize Alice's time, that is a low trust environment. That means that we think more highly of Alice and we think very lowly of Steve. And if that continues, we now create an environment where we maintain that hierarchy. And that's infantilizing your developers. And that creates an unprofessional environment because whoever was at the top first, whoever was considered the senior first, is now mandating gatekeeping and merging operations and merging culture for everybody else in the team, especially for the freshest juniors who just joined, which is very toxic. And it just promotes low psychological safety. Now, I made a few assumptions, sort of context-free generalizations. But this is the scenario, let's say, that I feel most comfortable about talking about, because it is the most common dysfunction that I've seen in teams when it comes to merging like this, right? So to summarize, if you don't want to control Steve, then also don't block the merge. If you want to help Steve, then help him early, not late. So help him during coding, not when he's done, because he won't be done. And then there will be this weird definition of done going on, and you'll always have two things in progress. And everybody else in the team, if they're also working like this, they'll also have two things in progress, unless Alice has pseudo permissions and she can self-approve her own tickets, but Steve can't. Or if Alice has another senior buddy and they just do that to each other, but not to Steve, right? That is not a very fair, and that is not a very trusting environment. Now, I also don't want to be judgmental, so I need to be careful, right? So Anjana says, maybe a huddle can help discuss the approach prior to code changes. I agree, but I would replace the word prior to with during, because, why should we huddle and discuss your code changes? That's already controlling, right? Like, if you found the during controlling, then the prior is even more controlling. Because now, even though I'll be left alone, I now need to juggle what promises I made about doing or not doing, and I will feel guilty about changing my mind because we discussed it. So if you want to be part of the discussion, just collaborate. And if you don't like the person, well, you shouldn't be working together in a company. And if you don't like them, but it's important to you to work at that company, I'm not talking about you, but like if Steve and Alice hate each other, but they like the job, then learning how to collaborate together is their primary growth trajectory. And as a manager, as their mentor, let's say, I would encourage that. It's like, hey, looks like the two of you don't get along. Shall we swap teams, or do you want to take this as a challenge? And maybe they need some, soft skill training. Maybe one of them just doesn't listen. Maybe one of them dominates the conversation, and then the other one feels dominated, and then they want to sort of shy away. Maybe the more assertive one feels dominated because of something that's going on in the conversation, and then they just decide it's not worth their time, or you are interrupting me, or you are disrupting my flow, or whatever, right? So I mean, you've seen it all probably, but that's a good suggestion, yeah. But like, turn the huddle into pair programming. Frequency of huddles must be decided by again, as long as you're presenting this problem as a Steve problem, the problem will remain. Think of it more as them being equal. Think of it like this, Anjana. Suggestion. An invitation. Imagine Steve has his stuff and Alice has her stuff. Right? Or, even better, they are a freaking team, and the two of them together have to somehow agree on how to make the next two commits. Now, there are three ways to make the next two commits. Alice can work on one, Steve can work on the other. Alice and Steve can work together on the first and the second. Or Alice and Steve work on the first and then split for the second one. And then the equivalent for the other way around. Right? So now it's not up to Steve to decide when he's going to huddle, because there was no decision as to which of the tickets is his. Right? So what you're describing is only an issue if this ticket was assigned to Steve by somebody outside of this team, or if they have done that way in the past, like a few days ago, right? So it's like way out of context of the current workday. But then this assignment culture is the dysfunction. If Steve and Alice can work on it together, and they won't know if that's the case until Tuesday, if it's Monday, what day is it? If it's Friday today. So they might want to work on it together, but maybe Alice gets sick on Monday. Well, what they can do is they can say, Steve and Alice can book a meeting to pair on Monday, and Steve can say, I'll be free on Monday, I'll start working on this. Alice can say, okay, can I join? Okay, let's book a meeting. And then they join on a pairing session for like 2 hours, and then Alice leaves, and then Steve continues on his own. That's okay. Or they can agree that whatever they do on that pairing session, they will deploy to production. That's my preferred way of working. So we don't have this split of your work, my work, and then we collaborate. No, we just say whatever we manage to create, like in 60 or 70% of time of that collaborative session, we will deploy together. So that at the very least, the thing we did together is deployed. So it doesn't require review. So there isn't that part of this is what we did together, and then I continued without you, and I ended up rewriting, and you should review, you shouldn't review, right? So just deploy the freaking thing that you built together. Learn how to work in such small steps so that even a 2-hour pairing session, 90-minute pairing session, produces a deployable increment. And then what happens is, rather than thinking about it this way, you can think, okay, we paired and we produced like 20% of what that ticket was together. We produced a smaller increment than that thing. Now the remaining work is smaller, and this we deployed. And this is now on main. That's what collaboration looks like. And then Alice is busy. Alice is on some training, and Steve is now working alone. And because he's alone, he's deciding, you know what? Okay, that leftover bit, I'll do that alone because nobody else is available. I find that much more healthy. There's a lot less, is it mine, is it yours? There's a lot less bad blood regarding who starts, who continues, who's allowed to change it. Again, coming from a very extreme programming-esque. And I will give you an example. I'll give you an example because, yeah, hang on. One more question. Kalian, prior, during, perhaps a lame restaurant analogy. The master chef does not collaborate with other chefs during the preparation of the dish and doesn't inspect it prior to serving, no? It is slightly different. In a restaurant, there's a very strict monotasking limit. Most dishes in the restaurant require one operator with 2 hands, right? So it is a mostly hand and sort of manual, like, hand-based work. So you're limited by the amount of hands on the process. Bodies might be in the way, right? So 3 people can't be in front of the stove because the stove is dimensioned to 1 person, right? The stove is the stove is at hip height to the width of 1 human being, 1 normal-sized, average-sized human being. Right? So there are technical constraints of how it's set up. But software engineering is a brain-constrained activity, and usually a reading-constrained activity. Like, we need to read more context to write the right thing. It's not a write-limited activity, because then ChatGPT would have taken all of our jobs already. Right? So when there's multiple brains involved, the restaurant analogy does not apply. And the restaurant analogy also has a reason while the head chef is doing all the work. The head chef simply might have a more superior palate. He might pick up differences in taste that the others don't, because that might actually take 10, 15 years to train. Whereas in software engineering, those limits are much smaller. Those limits are usually architectural. But I'm glad you brought it up. I'm aware that the analogy itself, the metaphor, doesn't apply fully. And I think we should I'll talk about this a little bit more, but I need to check the agenda because I might be waffling a little bit. Anjanam says pairing makes sense on no matter who has taken the ownership of the item. Yeah, pairing makes sense. And I would have an example for this that you might not like. Then Thomas says, I love you for advocating and supporting real cooperation so vehemently. Thank you. Hang on. Where are we? Yeah, I think we are. I think, yeah. I mean, you guys are reading my mind. Yeah, this was mostly about pairing efficiency, and now now Anjana talked about ownership. Yeah, like you guys are on top of things today. You guys are on top of things, right? Because let's talk about ownership, right? So we just discussed pairing efficiency, like how can we make pairing more efficient? So rather than saying we will pair for 2 hours and then you continue alone, flip it around. Let's pair for 2 hours and we deploy what we created together. And then the thing we deployed, we remove from the to-do. We create a separate ticket from it. We close it. We create a separate branch if necessary. Create a second pull request if necessary. We review it together. We merge it. We push it. We test it. We publish it. And then there's nothing in progress. And I leave. And you decide what to do on your own. And then if you end up being on a feature branch for 2 weeks, that's on you. At least the thing we've created together is now deployed. That's my point. That is how I would suggest you start introducing pairing into your team. Is to deploy aggressively whatever the team produces before they disband. And if you can't do that, that is your next growth objective. If you can't easily deploy something that you just spent an hour or 2 hours creating, because it might not have enough, I don't even know how to describe it, doneness, I don't know, scope, then that's a problem. It's a problem worth addressing, because that is then blocking all other positive behaviors of high-performing teams. Right sizing, working in small steps, etc. Continuous delivery, continuous integration, feature flags, testing automation. Testing automation that tests only what you changed, not the entire system, right? So then you just knock those little dominoes over, like every little bit of resistance one by one, and it just opens up a much more lighter, much more smoother, stress-free way of working. The high performers, they work stress-free. Anjana says, yeah, pairing eventually increases the trust. I mean, it might make it worse for a while. I mean, just because me and some stranger spend time together doesn't mean that our trust is increasing over time. I paired with people who, the more I paired with them, the less I trusted them. Because they annoyed me, because I saw they were sort of disrespectful and they had like a weird way of working with other people. And I didn't know about that when I didn't pair, right? It's like they kept it to themselves. And then the more I paired with them, the more I saw it's not a fit. So I wouldn't say this is universally true. There will be dysfunction. There will be personality clashes on every team. But they have to come out. Right? Like the first test to any team is whether they, like that particular generation of the team, whether they can work together as a team. And every time there's a new member, you got to test that on all fronts. That's really hard. There's no easy way about this. But don't assume that not everybody is deserving of your trust. Trust is a sacred thing that belongs to you sort of building with somebody else. And you build it by trusting them. But they can easily betray that trust. It's just like you need to weigh in the risk factor to how much you trust them to build the trust. If you trust them too much, too early, it can backfire if you're not ready to deal with the consequences. Right? So there's a level of life experience here and naivety and just overall maturity and professionalism. right? So senior engineers, what does that title even mean anymore? Are called senior just because they have 3+ years of experience, 5+ years of experience. What's more important is that you need to be a senior professional. I would trust a senior professional, of any engineering caliber. I would trust a junior who's a senior professional, right? If somebody has worked in a, I don't know, Michelin star restaurant for 20 years and their career switched to software engineering, I would trust them much more than a generic senior engineer, of course. But that doesn't mean that it only goes one way and that everybody is deserving of it. That it is a constantly permeating, increasing entropy, right? So that's, yeah, as long as 5 people are put into the same basket and they don't leave, trust will naturally increase by entropy. That's not the case, sadly. I wish it was that way. Of course, the level of respect and mutual sort of experience does happen. But I think it's better to think about it from a general business perspective. Everybody's lifestyle and conditions will generally improve over time. But sometimes the best decision for one of your coworkers that you don't get along with is that you switch jobs or they switch jobs, and everybody's life is improving. But the boundaries are changing, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing sacred about those artificial boundaries, like which company you work for, etc. Unless you make them sacred. But it has to come from within. Okay, I'm waffling. What are we talking about? Ownership. Sorry. Oh, actually, I forgot to put on some background music. What did we have last time? Some kind of guitar, right? So, yeah, when it comes to ownership, I like having this sort of detached approach to ownership. Right? So now tell me, and I will now change it from I will now make a Danish thing. Right? Now, if Bob is here working on this, right? So I'm the kind of person who, if I see Bob working on a branch and they have 2 commits and they have pushed those commits, I have zero shame, zero reservation going into Bob's branch and changing something. I'll let him know. I might call him for a pairing session, but I have zero reservation in changing something. Zero. Right? Because I don't ascribe to branch ownership. I don't believe you own the branch. I think the company owns the branch. And if we work for the same company, I can come in here and I can change something. Now, I am changing it because I might need something from it. What I don't ascribe to is changing something you're actively working on because I think you're wrong. Because I can do it better. That I wouldn't do. I find that annoying and disrespectful. But I just want to highlight the difference there. If you haven't merged it, I might merge it for you. Right? I might go into your branch, take something useful, yoink it out into another branch and merge it. Even if you felt you're not ready. Because I'm encouraging that level of integration thinking. Now, if you're open to the idea, if you're Bob, I will invite you to this process. But I don't share any authority. Like, if you tell me not to do it, I might still. Right? Because I don't acknowledge branch ownership. right? So I am inviting them to the educational, like to the learning bit. But my bullshit detector goes off when Bob has been working on this branch for 2 weeks and they say, no, don't touch this. This is mine. I'm that kind of facilitator. No, obviously I still handle it as gracefully as I can, but to me this is a sign that Bob needs help. And maybe things have soured so much between Bob and his team that Bob will just prefer to work alone. And that is always a red flag. Somebody wanting to work alone in absence of their team and just be left alone, that is always a red flag. Because I will tell you, 90% of the time, when I had such a Bob on my team, the more you leave them alone, the sooner Bob needs to get fired. Because there will be an issue, disgruntlement, and then this will get worse. I want to be isolated on X, I want to work alone on Y, I don't want to be involved, right? So this fencing behavior, almost territorial behavior, I don't know why, but engineers love to do it. Some personality of engineers love to do it. And it's not about productivity, it's not about flow, it's not about being an introvert. I've heard it all. There's no practical productivity reason behind it other than not getting along with the team. And if you're not getting along with the team, either there's something terribly wrong with you or something terribly wrong with the team. Possibly the environment is not compatible with you, and whoever is in charge of that is not doing any steps to make your life easier. So number one, push through the barrier and try to make Bob's life easier. Because the issue is, the longer Bob works like this on an isolated branch, the larger the buffer for stress he takes on, which means his sensitivity will increase over time, which means he'll be more susceptible to surprises, like his range of negative emotion will be more prone to bigger swings. And that's just going to create conflict. I mean, it'll just sow the seeds for conflict. I've seen no practical approach here where a slow, gentle, isolationist strategy would ever produce a positive outcome. Sadly. I wish it wasn't like that. Wait, I have some scribbles. Let me clean the scribbles. I just wanted to highlight this because this happens often. This happens frequently. Anjuna says, true. It is not always a new member though. It could be the tenured member hoarding information. I agree. Yeah. Pairing doesn't always increase trust, and that is the definition of toxic. Agreed. This is Thomas, I believe. Let me check actually. Let me check if you guys send me some notifications that I missed. We're good on time. We're gonna finish soon, don't worry. I know it's Friday. Yeah, that's Thomas Kaloyan. Okay, Thomas has a second comment. I missed a comment. Akshay, I'm very sorry. You posted 40 minutes ago. Your comment didn't come through to me. So Akshay says, great topics. Metrics and collaboration are crucial for effective pull requests. The focus on active collaboration and metric evaluation is much needed. Thank you. I hope you're not a bot. But thank you. Okay, what else did I miss? I'm very sorry. No, okay, that's it. Okay, we're up to date. Okay, cool. Where are we? Thomas. For example, is it the team's or the group's job not to leave Bob alone and isolated? Question mark. And then follow up. However, many companies do not want this behavior because it is too expensive and may waste time. Well, they will not want this behavior because they think it is expensive. That doesn't mean that it is the right thing to do, and it doesn't mean that it is more expensive. I would always start this debate there. Like, let's not assume that they are correct in that. If you're not measuring whether they are correct, I wouldn't by default assume correctness. With everything in software engineering, assume you're wrong. Assume you're wrong, and you just need to put your cards on the table, and you need to say, okay, what is the right problem to solve? Right. So with your first question, is it the team's job not to leave Bob alone and isolated? Yes. If you have a playground and there's a team and the team goes in a bus or a little what is it called? A van. They go in a van and they go on a road trip, and one person drifts from the group all the time and they want to be left alone. Of course there's an issue there that's worth addressing. They will have to sleep together, find shelter together, eat together, find logistics together. They are driving together. They are spending the entire freaking vacation or road trip or whatever it is together. If one person suddenly wants to be alone, just wanting a bit of alone time to decompress and recharge, that's okay. The rest. But wanting to be left alone as a virtue constantly, as being labeled as the person who always works alone, that is always a group problem. Right? Imagine in soccer analogy. I tell you, hey, I'm front field, left side. When you pass me the ball, I will play alone. I will try to score or hit it out, but I will not pass it to somebody else. Is that a team problem? Of course it's a freaking team problem. When I'm working, I want to be left alone, and I won't be reviewing anybody's pull requests until I am done. Is that a team problem? Heck yes, that's a team problem. And the team should aggressively address that. And if the team doesn't know how to aggressively address that, aggressively meaning not aggression, not to show aggression, but to say, oh, this is a red flag, immediate attention. Right? To say, okay, no, this can, sprout roots and seep into our culture. We need to clean this up. Aggressively in the context of sterilizing and washing your hands, as it was in the lockdown era, right? Where contactless was important, a priority. A soccer team is contactful. Now, there are exceptions, of course, but they are never worth long-term isolation. Okay, we're still in ownership, right? Yes. Okay, so what does ownership mean? So I highlighted this example of jumping on somebody else's branch because I don't think you are owning the code when it's on your branch you've created. I think that's silly. I think that's egoistical, and I think that's way too individuated. It's the company's code. It's the company's code when it's on my laptop. It's the company's code when it's on my branch. It's the company's code when it's deployed. It's the company's code when it's on my clipboard and my editor. It's always the company's code. There isn't this transfer of ownership when I merge it. Ownership is about something else. Ownership is about having discrete parts of your system and saying, Dennis owns this part by virtue of experience. And I'm sort of connecting the dots a little bit with the next few shows when we talk about legacy code and different topics. But ownership doesn't mean that I get to decide what happens to this code. Ownership means I really understand this part of the product. Who owns this knowledge? I own most of this knowledge. But I don't own this knowledge by virtue of exclusion. I own this knowledge by virtue of having lots of touch points with this code. Meaning, I own knowledge of this subsystem because I have added a lot to this part of the code base, because I have refactored a lot in this code base, because I fixed a lot of bugs in this part of the code base. That's what ownership means. And if you look at tools like CodeScene, they will also attribute ownership based on, okay, which author has the highest change frequency recently over this file? Who touched this file? And now I want to talk about touch points. Okay. Ownership. Touch points. So what are touch points? Something that a lot of people get surprised by when I mention is that extreme programming is a much more rigid system than Scrum. Right, so Scrum, Caliban, you're still here? Extreme programming is known for this idea of we should assume we're wrong, which means we'll be making changes to the system. So it's this refactoring fearlessly kind of attitude. Whereas Scrum is more this implementation of Agile where we can do anything as long as it's in iterations. But usually the things we plan, we very rarely plan to go back and refactor the same thing, which is why I prefer the extreme programming approach, because it makes you focus rigidly on the importance of collaborating with the customer and committing to this ideal of I will keep changing it until you say it's okay. And if you say no, way off the mark, I will throw it away, refactor it, keep what I can, and then replace what I can't. And what I wanted to, I have a quote somewhere, I had it written down, just pull it up. The goal with extreme programming is to remove the resistance to changing code. That's the goal of extreme programming. In more traditional software development methods, you'll leave code alone once it's written, unless there's a bug. With XP, you scrutinize the code so carefully that developers may decide to rewrite it entirely after a single iteration. Right? And this comes back to ownership, right? So if I own this part of the code base where Bob has made a code change, and own mean I really understand it, then the longer Bob isolates himself and doesn't merge, the more he runs the risk of me understanding it and also working on something else in parallel, going, oh, I was wrong about this, and I will refactor it immediately, and I will change it immediately. That's the point, right? So this whole idea of staying on feature branches and having pull requests that last longer than a few hours is completely contrary to my ability to refactor whatever it is I want to refactor. It makes people defensive about refactoring because you have to constantly have this isolation triage. Okay, who's isolated? Did they touch that part of the code that I'm now refactoring? Because if I refactor it, then they might get a merge conflict when they pull. And I would much rather, if I know you're the only one, if you're Bob, if I know you're the only one working on this, then what I would do is, rather than refactor it on mainline and then merge it and then give you a merge conflict, I would yoink out the changes you've made, merge them, and then refactor them, and then I would merge them into your branch, and I will tell you to update your branch before you continue. right? That's what I mean by ownership. If I understand it much better, then I will aggressively help you in keeping your code in tandem with the product changes that we're making. Because it's possible that you are on some other priority given by somebody else in the team. You might be following marketing priorities, not so much behavioral priorities. And your personality just said that you want to be isolated because you're new and you want to prove yourself, right? But that's not a helpful. Again, I would still invite you to participate, do it with you. But if you're the kind of loner personality, it'll be very, very difficult to adopt extreme programming practices. Because extreme programming is about this idea of we're not allowed to play telephone. Right, so I'm an adult. I need 3 things. I need to talk to the customer, which might be the stakeholders, which might be the product owner. I need to understand my boundaries, and I need to talk to the end user. And no telephoning. Like we can talk by proxy through somebody else on my team, but if it has to go through 5 people on telephone, the information, that's a waste. Which means I need to be able to talk to the people that I'm afraid to talk to. If the customer is angry, I need to learn how to deal with that. If the customer is disgruntled, I need to learn how to deal with that. If I as the product engineer, I as the tech lead, I as the QA person, right? So that's the whole point of extreme programming, which is why it is considered extreme. Is that it doesn't allow the introvert personality to isolate. It still respects introverts, but it encourages collaboration. It's like you're a waiter. You're a waiter in a restaurant, and there's a table you just don't wanna wait. You just don't wanna serve a table. There's something about a table you don't like. You might ask your friend to take over once, but then if this becomes a thing, that is then something you need to address. Right? If this becomes our thing, that person doesn't speak the language. I don't like speaking English. You take care of it. No, once, yes, maybe, but I would much rather help that person overcome that fear, because there's nothing positive. It doesn't set a growth mentality in that environment. And I've seen this kind of behavior as well. I've seen this in software teams. I've seen this in cafes. With cafe staff at restaurants. Okay, so much about ownership and touch points. Touch points also mean something else. A lot of people think that. I see. On touch points, just wanted to mention that it is possible. Your biggest problem in a software company is not a bus factor of 1. Your biggest problem is a bus factor is 0. Which means that there are modules in your system where the only person who had touch points with that module, recent touch points, has left the company, or is no longer with the team, or is now on a different team, or got promoted and is no longer touching code, or is no longer making product decisions. Right? So they're not even touching code, not even leading, not even architecting, nothing. And what happens is people then think. What needs to happen with this kind of system is, this is going to be expensive to change, and they mistake that for technical debt. They mistake the changes are expensive because it was abandoned, right? So nobody knows how it works. They think it's written badly. And such organizations would overemphasize rewriting this. But the issue is not in the rewrite. The issue is nobody has touch points with this code. What does that mean? Nobody has made changes to this code ever, currently on the team. And the solution isn't to rewrite it. The solution is to refactor it. Refactoring in this context means if there's an issue, just make changes to it. Bug fix in it. Make changes to it that are not invasive. Learn how to make refactoring changes in legacy systems. Focus on that. The more you'll move things around, the more touch points you'll start producing without rewriting it. And then, over time, you'll become the default owner once more. It might still have gaps, but at least you have touch points over the critical areas. Teams are usually very surprised when I do this. They think I'm an agile coach or they're a leadership coach, and they always ask me, Dennis, I didn't know you would code with us, and B, I didn't think you would code this early with us this much and so confidently. Because I will often know some very small part of their subsystem much better than they do. Not because I have some like premonition understanding of their system or prior experience, but simply because I'm not afraid to make changes to it. Just because I have spent a lot of time learning how to safely make changes in an untested legacy system. Because usually the reason they hire me is because there's a lack of like confidence caused by lack of tests, or because there's a lack of certainty because there's no preset or predefined engineering culture for continuous delivery. And then when I show them that, it's just pure mechanical skill. I make refactoring changes, I wire my brain to better understand the system, and I make it easier to read, which means that within a week, I can make changes cheaply in their subsystems, which they thought was impossible. They thought it would be expensive forever until we rewrited the entire thing. Now, why is obvious question that I think is coming? If I'm refactoring, why isn't it rewriting? And I'm glad you're asking. I prepared for this presentation so well. So a rewrite and a refactor are not the same thing, right? So a rewrite would be a reconciliation or reconsolidation of tech debt, which means there's something expensive here and we throw it away and we just take the same requirements and we recreate it from scratch. Now what I'm doing is different. When you're refactoring, especially in a legacy system, sometimes what I'm doing is actually just introduce a lot of feature flags in it, and I'm adding new functionality in parallel to the old functionality. So you'll notice that I very rarely remove code from such a system to build familiarity with it. I'm just adding something along the side, maybe feature flagging it to toggle it, and then see if it produces the same results. This is usually called the strangling pig approach if it's more architectural. But you can also use it on a very low tactical level, like on a class, on a function, on a method, on a package, depending on your language that you're using, in a module. Right, so it's very, very possible to just refactor something, add seams, right? So lacking abstractions, right? So seams are, things are not changing on the seam, but they are changing on that side and they are changing not on this side, but the seam seems to be stable. And I just add constructs for the seams. I'm not rewriting the original system. In fact, most of the original behavior is still running on the old code. I'm not adding or taking anything away, but I am making the top-down vision of the system, of how it is architected, much clearer to follow by adding layers or inversions in certain areas. And then those little surgical incisions, those are then touch points that give me confidence to work in that code base. Again, very focused on like a small part of the code base, but you can learn how to do this. The book, Michael Friedrich's book, Working Effectively with Legacy Systems, is a good example. We're reading what's the title? Domain Modeling Made Functional in the book club right now, which might make it easier to think about like very small atomic units of behavior, like a function, very simple data transformation. I see engineers gasp at this when I tell them that their entity in their ORM is not their most atomic unit of behavior. The most atomic unit of behavior is probably transforming, is one of the aggregate functions in one of the queries. And they probably usually don't have it modeled. And then when I start modeling it in front of them, with them, to teach them, they suddenly become aware of much more granular, smaller steps that they could have taken, but they always thought that their system needs to change. Every change to the system needs to be at least this big, and they don't know how to make a change this small. And then that level of pressure then takes their confidence away. Another aspect of rewrite/legacy refactoring that comes to mind is when it comes to modernizations of systems. Sometimes you just benefit a lot more by just upgrading. Maybe you're in an old React app, and maybe the upgrade path from React 11 to 12 was very clunky then, 5 years ago. But maybe now there's an upgrade path plus AI directly to React 18, which is trivial from 11. Right? So maybe as time goes on, the tools got so much better that it's just easier to upgrade it and solve it with the newer framework or the newer tools than it would be to just maintain the old system. And sometimes they do this with strangle pick pattern as well, where rather than looking at the old system and thinking, okay, so this is the old framework, okay, where's the documentation for the old framework? Just add the new framework, the same framework, in parallel, and then just add a seam of abstraction to just make those two systems work together. Sometimes it's hard and it takes some time, but it's always worth it because it, again, produces touch points for the team for building confidence. We had one more aspect to it regarding self-approvable PRs. So, and this is from Galen. Galen? I need to. Adrian once corrected me on what the correct pronunciation is, but I don't think he's with us today. Let me know if you're here. So, self-approvable PRs, it's always this idea of why do we have PRs in the first place? Again, self-approvable means that only Steve worked on it, and Steve approves it. So when you're done, the commit only has one author. I don't mind this, right? Because if I have a test suite, and I can prove with my test suite that what I did is correct behavior, and the test suite is green after I'm done, and the test suite can check whether I've added a test for what I wrote, very important, then self-approve at your heart's content. Merge it, just say, I'm confident this is the correct merge, I have a test to prove it, pipeline's green, I will merge it. If there is a risk of, if you don't have coverage testing, or if your team doesn't actively do TDD, it's possible that functionality works, but you forgot to test cover something. At that point, I would still merge it to main, but then ask for a second opinion by someone and asking them, hey, I added this commit, could you take a look? And that helps a lot if the team is collaborating actively, right? So if you and I are scheduled to pair anyway on Monday, I will merge it today, no problem, and then on Monday we review it together. Right? Because regarding self-approvable PRs, what you need to consider is that the importance of consistency, let's say, or traceability to the mainline branch is very important. See, if I have main like this, then you might create a branch out of this out of this commit, let's say. But what's really important information is whether this commit was green. That is the important information. Which means that if you're not happy with the design, I don't care about that. Because for the stability of the process, what we should care about is whether it was a stable commit. A stable commit which is provable by all the tools at our disposal. Because if I didn't refactor it, no problem. But if there was an issue with it, then there might be a problem with every single branch that has branched from this commit. And then maybe each branch author discovers that problem independently, and they will mistakenly think that they have caused it. Because they are working under the assumption that mainline is green. Because even though it was merged, it might not have been deployed, so they might have made naively this assumption that, oh, if it was on mainline, it's probably deployed, and if it's deployed, there's probably no issue, and if there's no issue, it's probably safe to branch from this. Right, so one of the things that I think people underestimate is if you have no proof that this commit is green, simply branch from a different commit. Just pick the last green one. Pick the one that you trust to be green and just branch from there. I see Adam Dimitruk do this a lot. He notoriously opposes TDD, and he even says, just pick a freaking branch, like a commit, and he says everybody who works will work on an independent slice. Maybe there will be one person on each slice, or one of the more complex ones, there's two people pairing on it. But please, everybody pick the same commit to start from. We will plan ahead so that every person, every team has an independent vertical slice. And then even when we merge some of them, we will continue to only create branches from this commit until we have a stack dependency, right? Where I have to stack my changes based on some other branch. Because the importance, because they do test during, test after, or test before, but not TDD. And I saw Adam's workflow, and now that I've seen like this rigor and this discipline, I agree with that, right? Like they are doing a TDD equivalent rigor. It isn't TDD, right? So it's the same amount of intensity in the discipline, but it's a different discipline. And I think it's really important. So if I end up merging something into main that you suspect is not okay, well, just branch from some other branch then. You don't have to trust my branch. And trust means something very specific, right? Trust means that the pipeline, the build says it is green, but you suspect it's not okay because you haven't reviewed it. Sure. Trust your instinct. Take one of the previous commits that you do trust and branch from there. You start work from there. And then as we're pairing, I will show you, or we will debunk whether this is correct or not. And if it's not correct, that means that I missed a test. And then we will add it, and then it'll be green for the right reason, and you can verify whether the test is accurate. And then you'll have regained your trust again, and then we can just continue working on mainline again. Right, but I see this mistake all the time. People spend hours and weeks, days, weeks on branches, and then they mess up an octopus merge, and then they immediately after the merge, they deploy, and there's an immediate issue. Which means, if this happened during a weekend or in between sprints, a lot of people have created branches from this commit, and it wasn't stable and nobody knew, and now there's resynchronization issues, and that is a huge waste of time, right? So my point is, self-approval on the commit is less harmful if you have a pipeline that you trust to some degree, or if you self-approve to introduce the pipeline. I now had a coaching client ask me, Dennis, is it okay that I'm sort of he's adding GitHub Actions to his project. He's sort of slowly going into continuous delivery. He said, like, is it okay if I just create it on a branch? And it's like, yeah, that's normal. Like GitHub Actions, everybody who's introducing GitHub Actions on their project is self-approving, committing, and just spamming the commit pipeline to test and to get more experience with the pipeline, to get more touch points with the pipeline. And then once they're happy with it, I'm sure they will merge it, because they will immediately see the value of everybody being able to run it. And then they'll probably not ask for approval, but they will ask for everybody to adopt it on their branch and ask for suggestions on how to further improve it. Like, that's the point. If I commit something, I don't want you to hassle me for design. I want you to make suggestions. Like, this is what I committed. Is there a way to make the product better? Not, did I make a mistake in my design? Because it's a very infantilizing gatekeeping strategy that you learned to do with juniors that you don't trust. But high-performing teams don't have to work that way. Even it's harmful to them, which is why I'm advocating for a very pragmatic style of collaboration. Okay. We got through. I said I would stop earlier, but actually it's exactly 2 hours on the point. Thank you for your questions. It's very lovely to have live participation. Thomas, Kalayan, Anjana, Ali, and all of the anonymous viewers. Thank you so much for being here. I hope this give you some insights into the state of pull requests in 2024, what the alternatives are, what they're for, what they provide, what the real output of a pull request can be, what you can replace it with, in which situations it's silly, in which situations it's harmful, a little bit of team dynamics. If you find yourself snaking, right? So you create a PR and then you branch out from that PR and you create a second PR and then you branch out from that and you create a third PR. If you don't end up having rebase hell, there's a solution to that. It's called stacked diffs, where the main branch is zipping upwards towards your branch rather than requiring a merge from the top side. There are a lot of tools for that. I prefer not to use them unless you're in an organization that already has custom tools for Git. And then we discussed refactoring, touchpoints, and ownership of code. Right, so just refactor whatever you'll have to work on. Just go in, make some improvements, get to know it, commit, self-approve if necessary. But most importantly, continuously build pipelines that give you proof that whatever you build is safe to merge. Even if it requires feature flags and you explicitly turning what you built off. If you don't know whether what you build is safe to merge, add a feature flag and turn it off, merge it, and then review it together when there's a reason, when there's proof that it's not safe to turn on. Then add that test and fix it. But integration is much more important than never breaking anything. If you integrate and if you turn it on, if you integrate with a feature flag, and if it's on the on state for a new feature, it breaks stuff, it's still important that it is safe to merge when it's off. That is so valuable information that a lot of developers that don't practice TBD, strong-based development, are getting way too late feedback on. Because then they might fix it, but it's still not safe to merge because of some completely unrelated issue. And then once they address this, they might break the behavior. And then they have to do this back and forth of pulling from main, testing again, fixing it again, pushing to main. 2 days have passed, I have conflicts again. And there's nothing disheartening than, feeling like you're hassling somebody to review your branch again. I didn't go into a lot of detail on this, but a lot of teams that work like Steve and Bob and Alice, like the leave me alone kind of mentality, it can deteriorate into a state where you review something, it gets rejected, Steve adds 2 more commits, and then they ask, hey, can you review it again? And now Alice doesn't know. Okay, am I reviewing everything again? Just the commits? Is everything up until that point mergeable and I should review this? Or was that the and then they just keep working. And then, God forbid, there's a course correction or it goes through QA and somebody says, no, actually we got a requirement wrong, right? Like that does not put you in a state where you can, of extreme programming, where you can say, oh no, we were wrong. We need to change the code. Which means it better, if you're changing the code, refactoring or changing the requirements knowingly, it's better be merged the main. Because otherwise you'll be afraid to refactor. And you know me, if you can't refactor fearlessly, that's already a sign that there's an immediate growth path available to the team. Let's put it that way. Thank you so much for being with me today. Announcement for next week's episodes are already up. We have a guest next week. We're talking about interim CTOs, fractional CTOs, how having a CTO advisor can improve and affect your teams. Super excited about that conversation. There'll be a second announcement as well. We'll be making a plan, make these a little bit more stable, the streams. The Thursday streams are definitely off because I have a huge clash with daycare that I didn't have before. And yeah, have a lovely weekend, get some rest, and as always, continue to be awesome, and see you next time. Ciao.